Xavier Hensley sat in his office, staring at the latest employee satisfaction reports. The numbers didn't make sense. His toy factory, the one he had inherited from his father, had always been a place where workers felt valued. At least, that's what he thought. But now complaints about low wages, overworked staff, and poor management were piling up. His executives assured him it was just the usual noise, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. He had spent his life trying to live up to his father's legacy, but somewhere along the way, he had become disconnected from the factory floor. He had never worked in the production line himself, and most of the employees had never even met him in person. The company had grown to 13 factories across the country, and with that expansion, it became easier to rely on reports instead of first-hand experience. That was about to change. The next morning, disguised in worn-out jeans, steel toe boots, and a gray hoodie, Xavier walked into the largest of his factories as Ben, a new trainee. His beard was slightly overgrown, and he wore thick framed glasses that altered his appearance just enough to make him unrecognizable. The hiring manager, a woman named Claire, barely glanced at him as she handed him a uniform. "Welcome to the factory," she said flatly. "You'll be shadowing Dean today. Just try to keep up." Dean, the shift supervisor, was a burly man in his 50s with rough hands and a permanent scowl. He barely acknowledged Xavier as he led him through the bustling factory floor. The air smelled of plastic and paint, the sound of conveyor belts and machinery filling the space. Workers moved quickly, assembling dolls, action figures, and board games, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. "You're on packaging," Dean said, pointing to a station where a man in his late 30s was sealing boxes. "This is Lucas. He'll show you what to do." Lucas looked up and gave Xavier a tired but friendly smile. "First day? Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it." Xavier watched as Lucas expertly folded, taped, and stacked boxes, never missing a beat. His hands were fast, his movements precise. Yet, despite his efficiency, Xavier noticed something. Lucas was exhausted. Dark circles sat under his eyes, and his shoulders sagged. "Long shift?" Xavier asked as he clumsily tried to copy Lucas's movements. Lucas chuckled. "Always. I work double shifts most days. Got 3 kids at home. Gotta make ends meet." Xavier frowned. "They don't pay overtime?" Lucas hesitated before answering. "They do, but barely. And we don't get raises, so the only way to survive is working extra hours." Xavier's stomach tightened. This man was clearly one of the hardest workers here, yet he was barely scraping by. A loud voice interrupted their conversation. "Lucas, quit talking and work faster." A tall man in a crisp blue shirt stood nearby, arms crossed. Xavier quickly recognized him as Derek, the factory manager. He had read Derek's reports before, always full of excuses for why production was lagging. Now seeing him in person, Xavier didn't like what he saw. Lucas immediately picked up his pace, his hands moving even faster. Xavier noticed the exhaustion in his eyes as he focused on his work. Derek turned to Xavier. "And you, new guy. If you can't keep up, you'll be out by the end of the week." Xavier bit his tongue, nodding. He needed to see more before he acted. As the day went on, he observed more of the factory's problems. Machines were outdated, causing frequent delays. Workers were afraid to take breaks, worried about falling behind. And worst of all, Derek seemed to enjoy pushing people to their limits, treating them like disposable parts of the system. But Lucas never complained. Even when his hands cramped, even when his back ached, he kept going. By the end of the shift, Xavier had seen enough. Something had to change. And soon. Xavier's arms ached from lifting and sealing boxes. But that was nothing compared to what he had witnessed. The factory wasn't just inefficient, it was oppressive. Workers were treated like machines, and Derek ruled with an iron grip, ensuring no one dared to complain. As the shift ended, Xavier followed the exhausted crowd toward the break room. The space was cramped, with flickering fluorescent lights casting a dull glow over the mismatched chairs and dented vending machines. A few workers sat in silence, eating hastily prepared meals, while others simply rested their heads on the tables, stealing a moment of peace before heading home or starting another shift. Lucas sat down heavily, rubbing his temples as he pulled out a sandwich. Xavier dropped into the chair across from him, watching as other workers avoided eye contact, fearful of being seen slacking off. "How long have you been here?" Xavier asked. Lucas took a bite before answering. "Almost 12 years. His voice held no pride, just quiet endurance. Worked my way up from temp to full-time. Thought things would get better, but they never really did. Xavier leaned forward. What do you mean? Lucas hesitated, glancing around before lowering his voice. They used to care about the workers. When Mr. Hensley Sr. ran this place, we got decent bonuses, fair raises. Now, management says there's no budget for that. Overtime is the only way to survive. Xavier's jaw tightened. He had approved raises in the past, but now he wondered if they ever actually reached the workers. They never promote from within? Lucas shook his head. Not unless you're one of Derek's favorites. He keeps people in line by making them think they might get a better position if they stay quiet. But the truth is, he brings in his own guys, ones who won't challenge him. A woman at the next table scoffed. Derek only cares about numbers. He squeezes every last drop out of us and then blames us when things go wrong. Lucas nodded grimly. And if you speak up, you get the worst shifts, extra work, maybe even fired. Xavier's stomach churned. He had trusted Derek to run this factory fairly. Instead, the man had turned it into a sweatshop. The door swung open, and Derek strode in, his eyes scanning the room like a predator. The workers instantly quieted, some hurrying to finish their meals. He stopped beside Xavier and Lucas's table, arms crossed. Break's over in 5 minutes, he said coldly. I don't want to see anyone dragging when the next shift starts. Lucas gave a weary nod, but Xavier met Derek's gaze, searching for any sign of concern for his workers. He saw none. As Derek turned to leave, Xavier spoke. What happens if someone can't keep up? Derek barely glanced back. Then they don't belong here. The door shut behind him, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Lucas exhaled and stood. Come on, man. Let's get back before he finds a reason to make our lives worse. Xavier followed, his mind racing. He needed to see more, but he had already seen enough to know the factory was broken. By the middle of his second shift, Xavier had witnessed countless small injustices. Workers were refused bathroom breaks, yelled at for minor mistakes, and expected to meet quotas that were nearly impossible. The machines were outdated, constantly jamming, yet workers were blamed for delays. At one point, a conveyor belt malfunctioned, sending plastic doll parts scattering across the floor. A young woman named Maria scrambled to pick them up, her hands shaking. Before she could finish, Derek appeared, towering over her. You're slowing us down, he snapped. Maria stammered an apology, but Derek wasn't interested. If this happens again, don't bother coming back. Xavier's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to intervene, but he couldn't blow his cover, not yet. Later, as the shift dragged on, he found Lucas massaging his wrist between tasks. The man was clearly in pain, but he never stopped moving. You okay? Xavier asked quietly. Lucas forced a smile. Just a sore wrist. Comes with the job. Xavier frowned. Have you seen a doctor? Lucas let out a dry chuckle. Can't afford to. Besides, if I take time off, I lose my overtime. That means my kids go without. Xavier's stomach twisted. No one should have to choose between their health and feeding their family. Derek's voice suddenly echoed across the floor. All right, listen up. We're behind schedule again, so I need volunteers for a double shift. No complaints, no excuses. Lucas sighed, already stepping forward. Xavier grabbed his arm gently. You sure? Lucas nodded. Gotta do what I gotta do. As Lucas walked away, Xavier knew this had gone far enough. He had seen everything he needed to. By the end of the shift, he was no longer just an undercover CEO. He was a man on a mission. And Derek was about to find out exactly who he had been pushing around. Xavier watched Lucas disappear into the sea of exhausted workers while the factory floor churned with relentless movement. The hum of machinery filled the air, but beneath it lingered a tension that was impossible to ignore. People weren't just tired, they were drained of any hope that things would improve. It was time to put an end to this. He stepped away from the workstations and toward the manager's office. The door was slightly ajar, revealing Derek inside, staring at a tablet. Xavier knocked once, stepping in without waiting for permission. Derek barely looked up. What do you want? His tone was flat, impatient. Xavier shut the door behind him and took off his glasses. His voice was calm but firm. I want to talk about how this factory is being run. Derek finally looked up, squinting as recognition dawned. His posture stiffened and he set the tablet down carefully. Mr. Hensley? Xavier nodded. Closed the door. Derek obeyed, his confidence faltering. I wasn't expecting you to visit. Clearly, Xavier said, folding his arms. I've spent 2 full shifts working on your factory floor. You didn't notice. Derek forced a chuckle, but Xavier wasn't amused. Let's talk about what I did notice. Derek leaned back, trying to regain control of the conversation. Sir, if there's an issue, I can assure you we're working hard to maintain efficiency. Production has been. Xavier cut him off. Lucas. Derek flinched slightly. What about him? He's been here for 12 years, works double shifts just to survive, and has never received a raise, Xavier said. That's not efficiency. That's exploitation. Derek hesitated before responding. He picks up extra shifts voluntarily. No one forces him. Xavier's stare was unrelenting. When a man has to choose between seeing his children and putting food on their table, that's not a choice, it's desperation. And he's not the only one. Derek sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, I get it. It's tough for them. But this factory needs to hit quotas, and we can't afford to hand out raises to every worker who's been here for a while. Labor costs are already high. Xavier's jaw tightened. I approved a budget for wage increases last year. Where did that money go? Derek's expression flickered with something Xavier immediately recognized: hesitation. We had to reallocate some of it, Derek said carefully. Upgraded logistics, new tracking software. Tracking software doesn't put food on tables, Xavier interrupted. Neither does keeping the machines running on half their lifespan because you won't invest in proper maintenance. You're squeezing every last drop out of these workers while cutting corners everywhere else. Derek shifted in his chair. Sir, we have to be competitive. If we start raising wages, we'll lose our cost advantage. Xavier exhaled slowly, controlling his frustration. There's a difference between running a lean operation and running people into the ground. Derek was silent for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. What do you want me to do? Xavier's response was immediate. You're done here. Derek's eyes widened. Wait. You've built a culture of fear, Xavier continued. You've taken advantage of good people who just want to provide for their families. This factory doesn't need a manager who sees workers as disposable. Derek opened his mouth, but Xavier raised a hand. Pack your things. HR will handle your exit paperwork. Derek sat frozen for a moment, but Xavier didn't wait for him to argue. He turned and walked out, leaving the stunned manager behind. The factory floor was still moving at its usual relentless pace, but Xavier climbed onto a pallet near the center of the room and raised his voice. Everyone, stop what you're doing for a moment. Workers hesitated, looking around. Some slowed, unsure if they should obey. Lucas was among them, his brow furrowed in confusion. Xavier pulled off his hoodie, revealing the button down underneath. My name is Xavier Hensley. I own this company. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Some whispered, others stood frozen. I've spent the past 2 days working alongside you, Xavier continued. I've seen how hard you work. I've seen how much you sacrifice. And I've seen how this factory has been failing you. Silence stretched over the room. Derek is no longer with this company, Xavier announced. Effective immediately, we're making changes. No more stagnating wages. No more impossible quotas. No more fear-driven management. Lucas looked stunned. Maria covered her mouth with her hands. Others exchanged glances, unsure if they could believe it. Xavier stepped down from the pallet. Starting today, wages will be reassessed to reflect your dedication. Overtime will be fairly compensated, and promotions will come from within, based on merit, not favoritism. A murmur spread through the workers, disbelief turning into cautious hope. Lucas finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You really mean that? Xavier met his gaze. I do. And I should have been here sooner to see what was happening. Lucas nodded slowly, processing everything. The tension that had weighed on the factory for so long began to lift, even if just slightly. Xavier looked around at the faces of his employees, no, his people. Things changed today. And this time he would make sure they did. Xavier left the factory floor as the workers processed the seismic shift that had just taken place. He headed straight to the administrative offices where a handful of supervisors were still at their desks, unaware that their manager had just been fired. The air in the office was stale, the desks cluttered with reports and memos. Claire, the hiring manager who had barely acknowledged him when he first arrived, looked up from her computer screen. Her expression flickered with uncertainty as she recognized him. The others quickly caught on, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Xavier's voice was even but firm. We need to talk about how this factory is going to run moving forward. The supervisors exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect. Claire leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Sir, if this is about Derek, I assume you've already made your decision. Xavier nodded. He's gone. But this isn't just about him. It's about all of you. I need to know how much you were aware of. A man named Greg, a senior supervisor, cleared his throat. We followed Derek's lead. He set the expectations and we managed accordingly. Xavier studied him. Did you question him? Did you ever push back when he made decisions that hurt the workers? Greg hesitated. It wasn't our place to push back. Xavier's jaw tightened. It's your job to make sure this factory runs properly. That includes ensuring workers aren't being overworked, underpaid, or pushed to the point of exhaustion. Claire exhaled through her nose. With all due respect, sir, we weren't in a position to challenge him. He controlled everything. If we spoke up, we would have been replaced. Xavier leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. You're not wrong to say he held too much power. But silence allowed this to happen. That changes today. The room was tense. Greg adjusted his glasses, choosing his words carefully. What do you want us to do? Xavier straightened. Effective immediately, we're restructuring management. Promotions will be based on performance and leadership, not favoritism. Every worker will have a clear path to advancement if they earn it. No more gatekeeping. Claire nodded slowly. And wages. Xavier's voice didn't waver. Raises will be implemented based on seniority and merit. We're going to fix the wage stagnation that's been ignored for too long. I'll be working with HR personally to ensure those adjustments happen immediately. Greg exhaled, glancing at the others. And what about us? Xavier studied them for a long moment. That depends on you. If you want to be part of this company moving forward, you'll be expected to do more than just follow orders. If you see something wrong, you speak up. If workers are struggling, you fix it. You lead. Claire tapped her pen on the desk, considering. And if we don't? Xavier's expression was unreadable. Then you're free to leave. No one spoke for a few seconds. Finally, Greg nodded. Understood. Xavier turned toward the door. I'll be back tomorrow to go over the transition plan. Expect significant changes. As he stepped back onto the factory floor, workers were still murmuring among themselves, the weight of uncertainty hanging in the air. Xavier knew trust wouldn't be earned overnight. Words were one thing. Action would be another. He spotted Lucas near the packaging station, rolling his wrist absently as he spoke to Maria. Xavier approached and the two looked up, still adjusting to the reality of who he was. Lucas hesitated. So, is this real? The raises, the promotions? Xavier met his gaze. It's real. And overdue. Lucas nodded slowly, processing it. People are still going to be skeptical. We've heard promises before. Xavier's voice was steady. I don't expect blind trust. You'll see the changes happen. Maria glanced around at the others still watching. And Derek. Xavier didn't hesitate. Gone. A breath of relief passed through the workers who overheard. Maria shook her head, almost in disbelief. I didn't think that would ever happen. Lucas exhaled, rubbing his neck. You know, a lot of people here. They just wanted to be treated like they mattered. Like they weren't just numbers on a production report. Xavier nodded. That's exactly what's going to change. Lucas studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. Xavier shook it, feeling the roughness of years of hard work. Lucas's grip was firm. Then I guess we'll hold you to it. Xavier didn't flinch. You should. As he walked toward the exit, the factory didn't feel as heavy as before. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, the workers had something they hadn't had in years: hope. Xavier arrived at the factory early the next morning, stepping inside just as the first shift clocked in. The air carried a different energy, cautious, uncertain, but undeniably altered. Conversations hushed when workers noticed him walking onto the floor, their gazes flicking toward him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He made his way toward the supervisor's office, where Claire and Greg were waiting with stacks of paperwork. A whiteboard in the corner had notes scribbled in marker: shift schedules, efficiency targets, maintenance logs. It was the kind of operational mess Derek had likely kept under tight control, ensuring no one questioned his decisions. That control was gone now. Claire pushed a folder toward him. We pulled every worker's file. Years of service, wages, documented complaints, everything you asked for. Xavier flipped through the pages, scanning the names. Some had been here for over a decade with barely any wage increases. Others had spotless records yet had been passed over for promotions multiple times. At the bottom of the stack, Lucas's file stood out. 12 years. No disciplinary actions. No raises. He set the folder down. We're restructuring today. Greg, I want a list of employees who've been here the longest but haven't seen fair wage increases. They'll be adjusted first. Claire, I need to know who's been overlooked for promotions. We're going to correct that. Greg rubbed his chin, flipping through his notes. Some of them might need training before stepping into higher roles. Then we train them, Xavier said. No one should be stuck in the same position for years with no opportunity to grow. Claire crossed her arms, considering. You're making a lot of changes all at once. It's going to shake things up. Good, Xavier replied. This place needs shaking up. They spent the next hour drafting the new structure. Raises would be immediate for those who had been underpaid the longest. Supervisors would be required to document performance fairly, not based on favoritism. And moving forward, hiring managers would prioritize internal promotions before bringing in outside candidates. Once the plan was finalized, Xavier stepped back onto the floor, heading toward the packaging station. Lucas was already at his post, sealing boxes with practiced efficiency. His movements were precise, but there was a slight stiffness in his wrist, a sign of strain he had likely ignored for too long. Xavier stopped beside him. You've been working here for 12 years. Lucas barely glanced up. That's right. You should have been promoted years ago, Xavier said. That changes today. Lucas paused mid-movement, his grip tightening on the tape dispenser. He looked at Xavier, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. What are you saying? You're moving up, Xavier said. Supervisor role? Effective immediately. Lucas let out a short breath as if forcing himself to stay grounded. Just like that. You've earned it, Xavier replied. No more waiting for someone like Derek to decide who gets ahead. Lucas set the dispenser down carefully, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. I'll do the job right. I know you will, Xavier said. That's why you're getting it. He turned to the rest of the workers nearby. Expect more changes. Higher pay, real opportunities. No more intimidation. A few exchanged glances, still wary. Years of neglect didn't disappear overnight. Maria, who had been working beside Lucas, leaned against the workstation. People want to believe it, but we've heard promises before. Xavier met her gaze. Then I'll prove it. A voice spoke up from the other side of the floor. What about the machines? The question came from an older worker, someone who had likely spent more years in this factory than most. Xavier glanced at the equipment, some of which had been patched together with quick fixes rather than proper maintenance. New investments are coming, Xavier said. We can't run a factory on broken equipment and expect workers to make up the difference. A murmur ran through the crowd. Small, cautious nods. The first signs of trust. Xavier turned back to Lucas. You'll have full authority to report any issues. If something's broken, it gets fixed. If someone's struggling, they get the support they need. Lucas studied him for a long moment before nodding. I'll make sure the team knows. Xavier clapped him on the shoulder. Good. As he walked the floor, he could feel the shift happening. It would take time, but the factory was no longer a place where workers felt invisible. By the time he left that evening, the energy in the factory had changed. It wasn't just another shift. It was the beginning of something new.